of you for being outstanding. 2024 presidential candidate, American business leader. His company oversaw the development of 5 FDA-approved drugs. And his latest investment is a company called Strive. It's an Ohio-based asset management firm that directly competes with BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and others that will insist that people go woke in their companies. So they now have Strive as an alternative where they can maximize the return to their investors and not worry about politics. He's the author of 4 books. The latest one is in your goodie bag, Truth, the Future of America First. So with that, I'm going to bring up Vivek Ramaswamy, and he's going to tell us the truth.
Good. It's great to be here. You have a good, fearless leader in this man. He is, give him a round of applause for me. We became friends bonding around not just the classical debates that we'll have with the left, but actually, it's one of the things David encouraged me to do tonight, so I will, is talking about actually the debates that we're more uncomfortable having about the future direction of the American right. And that's what I appreciate about those of you who are in this room. You're here for a reason. The first thing I'll say is there has never been a more impactful time to be a leader in state government than right now in the United States. I truly believe that. And I think it's going to be leaders from, including, but not limited to, the next generation, who are going to wake up our Republican Party, not just to recite the shibboleths of yesterday, but to ask ourselves why we're saying the things that we're actually saying. And before I get into that, I just wanted to share with you probably one of my number one takeaways from the presidential campaign last year. I'm proud of how we did. I started with 0 name ID. People said, you started at 0.0 in the polls. I said, no, 0.00% in the polls. That's where we began. And only in this country can somebody in less than 9 months finish ahead of governors, a former vice president, multiple U.S. senators, in a race that is really decided by the people. That's one of the things that I took away most powerfully is how our system works. There's a logic built into it. But one of the lessons I learned is you're always going to make some kind of compromise. It's a question of which compromise you want to make. One compromise could be on style, actually. I think about my most successful moments over the campaign. There were many moments where I was in a confrontation with somebody from the left, and especially from the media, I would make it my goal and often succeed to defeat them. And there's time and place for that. But my favorite moments during the campaign were actually those where we encountered somebody often on a college campus or even a protester at an event who disagreed with us, but where we actually managed to persuade them. And I think that that's something that I wish I had done even more over the course of the campaign, looking over the course of that last year. I went to the campus of the University of Pittsburgh last week, and we had an opportunity to speak to many people who disagreed with us, but I believe we left that campus event with thousands of students attending it, having persuaded a few to think about a problem differently than they otherwise would have. And I think when we are able to change or compromise a bit on our style, that avoids us actually having to compromise on our principles. And I do think that this is one of the best pieces of, I don't know if it's best, but at least most useful pieces of advice I could offer from my learning over the last year, is that we often in the conservative movement may fall into a trap of refusing to be compromising on style, but actually when push comes to shove, when it comes to making public policy, end up compromising on the actual substance. I would rather remain uncompromising on our substance and on our principles, even if that entails at times resisting the temptation to take a slam dunk when it's available and instead take a different approach that allows us to actually, dare I say, bring the rest of the country along. And I'm going to ask you all to do the same. So thank you. But because of the people we have in the room tonight, I think this would be a wasted occasion if I told you, all the things that are in my book that are designed to persuade the American left. The American left is not in the room tonight. I'll save that for when I'm at the University of Pittsburgh's campus or the equivalent next time around. In this room, I'd actually like to have a different discussion, which is a reflection on the future of the American right. Now, I'll tell you where we are right now. I travel the country. I try to help down-ballot candidates more. President Trump, he needs all of our help, but he doesn't need me speaking with him alongside him at a rally. That doesn't move the needle one way or another. But with Senate candidates or House candidates or candidates for state office, I think it can actually make a difference, and that's where I've been focusing more of my time. And I'll tell you a trend that I've seen in traveling this country. Some of this is bitter medicine, but I'm going to offer it to you anyway. I hear candidates say things like, we're the party of the working class. We need to put American workers first, without actually pausing to ask themselves why they're saying these things or what these phrases actually mean. And I don't think that's a good development, actually, for any movement. I do think America First is the future direction of the Republican Party, but what does that phrase actually mean? We've got to pause and actually ask ourselves why we're uttering these phrases. This is part of why the neoliberal consensus of the last half century actually failed. It didn't fail just because it had some of the wrong policy prescriptions. For example, those that increased U.S. dependence on China, which I'll talk about more. That wasn't actually the reason for the failure. I think the reason for the failure is that it eventually used a new kind of intellectual laziness to insulate itself from being questioned, that then became the conventional wisdom for so long that 30 years later we have a country that depends on China for our own U.S. military, which doesn't make sense. What got us there was the unquestioning nature with which we imbibed those neoliberal myths, those neoliberal slogans. And I see a similar risk emerging in the so-called nationalist America First movement today, that I think our best insulation against that is actually to have an open debate that the neoliberal consensus of the 1990s didn't really have at the level we should have. So I'll tell you what's going on with the America First right now. We reject this idea that somehow we're going to export democracy through the spread of capitalism to places like China. That didn't work out. We thought we were going to use our money to get them to be more like us. That didn't work out. They used our money to get us to be more like them in many ways, right? They used access to their market as a cudgel to get American companies to, on one hand, apply emissions caps like BlackRock does to U.S. companies without doing the same to PetroChina. Getting Nike or Airbnb to spout off about injustices in the United States of America in the year 2021 about BLM without saying a peep about actual human rights atrocities in places like Xinjiang, where there's over 1 million religious minorities in concentration camps, subject to forced sterilization, communist indoctrination, and worse. That created a false moral equivalence between the U.S. and China, which erodes our greatest geopolitical asset, which is our moral standing on the global stage. So yes, there are ways in which that neoliberal consensus failed us. And the America First movement, as I see it, is a proper reaction to that mythology that somehow the spread of capitalism to places that weren't actually willing to adopt it was going to solve our problems, when in fact it created a geopolitical imbalance in reverse. I'd say the same about immigration policy. The historical consensus around immigration policy is that the sole objective of immigration policy in America is to maximize the size of the economic pie. Make no mistake, I'm a capitalist. I believe in maximizing the size of the economic pie. But immigration policy also entails a civic commitment that you make, selecting for the kinds of immigrants who are not only factors of production in labor, but are also seeking citizens of a new nation who pledge allegiance to their nation, their exclusive allegiance to this country rather than another one, who speak the language that allows us as citizens to communicate with one another, who pledge allegiance to the ideals enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, which wasn't quite a core concern of a neoliberal objective that was just about viewing the United States of America as an economic zone. So no, I'm not 1990s neoliberal, but what I will tell you is that there's a fork in the road ahead, though, for the America First movement, one that doesn't get discussed right now because it's not the core subject matter of the next 40 days on the path to this election. But what I believe we have in this room, I know from my conversations with David, what I know we have in this room are the actual leading vanguards of thought in the conservative movement, but who are also in places to drive change in this country at the state level and national level. And what I'd like to do for this group is to do something that I wouldn't do on the stump right now in the next 40 days. This would be a waste of time to talk about this on the campaign trail. But for you all, is to lay out what I see as a core division, intellectual division, within even the America First movement itself. On one camp, you have the protectionist camp, what I'll call the nationalist protectionist division. And on the other side, you have what I call the national libertarian vision. They are united in their rejection of the neoliberal philosophy of yesterday on issues relating to immigration and trade, particularly with China. But they have very different competing visions for the future of the United States of America. Let's start with the issue of trade. On the issue of trade and relations with China, the protectionist vision is that, yes, we depend on China too much for our goods, but we also depend too much on other countries for goods that we enjoy in this country, and that the top objective of U.S. trade policy should be to protect American manufacturers from the effects of foreign price competition. We have to make sure that American manufacturers are advantaged. That's the protectionist view. The national libertarian view is a little different. That says that actually the real problem is that we can't depend on an adversary, China, for our own modern way of life. By the way, even Friedrich von Hayek would have agreed with this. Take a careful reading of The Road to Serfdom. No nation should depend on an adversary for its own national defense. But crucially, that means that if we're really serious about reducing our economic dependence on China for our own military-industrial base, for our own pharmaceutical supply chain, for our own national protection, then that actually means more, not less trade with other allied nations like South Korea, Japan, India, the Philippines, Australia, and so on. But if you're truly a protectionist, then you actually believe in less trade with those countries because that's more protection from price competition for American manufacturers. But then you are necessarily delaying the amount of time it's going to take to actually achieve economic dependence from China in those critical sectors. There's no free lunch here. There is a clear choice about prioritization. The same question comes to the question of immigration. Both reject the neoliberal mythology of yesterday, but on different grounds. On the national protectionist view, the goal of immigration policy is really tantamount to labor policy. It is to protect American workers from the competition of foreign migrants to this country. The way this logic goes is if a company could hire an American worker at $20 an hour to perform a task, but there are two immigrants who are willing to perform that same task at $10 an hour instead, that would risk bringing down the price that the American worker earns. And the way we solve that problem is to keep the two immigrants out. Immigration policy as labor policy. These aren't Democrat ideas. This has nothing to do with Democrats versus Republicans today. There are Democrats who may agree with some of these ideas. I think there are Democrats who agree with the idea I just laid out. But this is a debate within the Republican Party. It is a dominant view of mainstream America First Republican thought today to believe that a core objective of our immigration policy is indeed labor policy to protect our workers from the effects of foreign price competition. That may be, you may think it's a good view, you may think it's a bad view, but it's worth at least seeing with plain eyes that that is an ascendant, if not dominant view in today's Republican Party. That's in contrast to the national libertarian view. And I put the national and national libertarian because the old libertarian view would just be bring as many people here as much as maximizes the size of the economic pie. We're an economic zone and do whatever maximizes the size of that pie. I reject that, but I put the national in front of libertarian because the objective of immigration policy here should be to enhance the civic quality of the United States of America. Admit immigrants who make America a better place, economically, but not just economically, but also in terms of our national pride and sense of civic commitments. That means that you shouldn't admit any immigrant to this country if they're going to be dependent on the welfare state. On the day they enter this country, if you know somebody's going to be a customer of the U.S. nanny state, Medicaid, welfare, and so on, they have no business entering this country or being admitted to this country. Don't admit anybody to this. Thank you. I'll take a applause for that. By the way, 75% of our immigration problem is solved right there. It's actually, and I'll tell you, I'll come back in a second to why the American right is unwilling to do it. I'll give you the punchline now. I'll come back to it anyway. The punchline is much of the American right is addicted to that nanny state. So if you actually want to take on that nanny state, you actually want to deal with the immigration problem, not just talk about it. You actually want to solve the immigration problem in this country. Go to the root cause of the immigration problem. What's the magnet in the first place? It is the welfare state in the United States of America. So dismantle that welfare state, you solve a lot of problems, including the immigration problem in this country. That's the stone cold hard truth. And the book is called Truths because it's not just hard truths to the left. It's mostly that, but it contains some hard truths for the right as well. But the alternative immigration policy is one that says that if you're going to be on the welfare state, you don't enter the country. If you can't speak English, you don't enter the country. If you don't know the first thing about the country, you can't pass the civics exam that we now require for citizenship when you enter the country, you're not in the country. Our immigration problem is mostly solved, but at that point, if the sole immigration population that you're allowing to enter the country are those who benefit the United States of America economically, that know on average more about the United States of America than the average kid who graduates from high school, that speaks English more effectively than the average kid who graduates from high school, and furthermore is also one that has renounced their citizenship to other countries to pledge allegiance to this one, now we're talking about an immigration system that actually could benefit the United States of America, even if that means, this is the hard part, even if that means there's going to be some incremental added competition for American-born workers. There is no free lunch. Just as in the case of trade policy, there's no free lunch. If you really want no nearshoring to our allies and want to exclusively focus on reducing trade overall, that is going to take a longer, not shorter time to declare economic independence from China. The same goes for immigration policy. If you want an immigration policy that selects for people who are economically self-sufficient, who are going to add value to the United States of America, who speak our language, who are ready to assimilate and pledge allegiance to this country, that may mean that certain sectors are going to face greater competition in the marketplace for workers relative to native-born Americans. That's a hard choice. There's no free lunch there. Both of these are actually America First positions. See, this is not about going backwards to the Republican Party of 2002. This is the question as we move forward to the, forget even the party, the conservative movement of the future. Which future do we choose? And where the rubber really hits the road is actually on the question of the regulatory state itself. There are two competing visions for the future of the regulatory state, including in this town in Washington, D.C., but frankly, in all the 50 states that are represented in this room as well. One view is that we want to replace the left-wing regulatory state with a new right-wing regulatory state. Now, I'll give you an example of a bad public policy that surely we all in this room agree on. It was Kamala Harris's signature economic policy. David, what did you think about it when she proposed a little economic brilliance, Nobel Prize worthy, price controls on the market for groceries? Will she earn the Club for Growth Prize of the Year? No, I think David's got the right reaction for that logic there. Okay, but so that's Kamala Harris. Price controls. We all know what's wrong with price controls. It's going to create supply shortages. History teaches us that. Venezuela teaches us that. Most other communist countries, the USSR teaches us that. You're going to create black markets. You're going to create collateral damage from those black markets. And then eventually in the long run, you're going to increase the very prices for the very goods that you thought you were controlling the price of because of those supply shortages. We all know that. So we in the conservative movement would never think of adopting price controls on groceries. Well, there's a bill pending in the U.S. Senate as we speak proposing price controls in the market for credit. They say there's going to be a cap on the credit card interest rates that credit card companies can charge. But you can't just pass that into a law. You need an administrative agency to enforce it. That's why we have the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, first chaired by Elizabeth Warren, brought to you by the Dodd-Frank Act of 2008, after the bailouts, by the way, that we should have never had in 2008. And they're now saying, I will tell you, it's a bipartisan point. We'll take the round of applause for that. But that bill proposing price controls, which you know what price controls do. They create supply shortages. They create black markets. They increase the very prices of the very goods that you thought you were trying to control the price of. That one wasn't proposed by a Democrat. It was actually proposed by a Republican. And it's pending in the Senate Banking Committee. And I will tell you, on the right is gaining quite a bit of steam behind that particular bill. It requires the CFPB to administer it. So it's a competing attitude to the regulatory state. Replace the left-wing regulatory state with the right-wing regulatory state. And the CFPB is the same one that we conservatives, including across the American right, would appropriately scold, give them a nice little slap on the wrist for asking small businesses across the country to report their racial and gender data. No conservative wants that. And the America First right in the protectionist camp or the national libertarian camp. But here's the thing. Why would we expect anything different of that agency to say, okay, we're going to slap you on the wrist for holding small businesses hostage for access to credit or otherwise based on racial and gender employment composition data? But then to say, okay, now that we've slapped you on the wrist, we're going to give you that much more power to implement a ceiling on credit card interest rates that could be exploitive. That is the future question for the future direction of America First. In a nutshell, of a very specific example, do we want to empower the CFPB to advance so-called conservative pro-American goals? Or do we want to get in there and actually shut it down, which I believe is the principled answer? You go to the same, that's your choice. You can say the same thing in the Department of Transportation. You have conservatives who have supported bills to say we actually need to empower the Department of Transportation to make sure that planes aren't falling out of the sky, as we see with, I mean, it's ridiculous. You have doors of Boeing manufactured airplanes that are literally flying off midair, something you would have never imagined in this country 30 years ago. You have trains going off the rails in my home state, in places like East Palestine, Ohio. It's not a joking matter. One answer to that question, and my goal here is to be descriptive, at least before we're prescriptive, because I think it's worth understanding the best arguments on all sides. One argument to that view is a conservative response that says that we're not the Republican Party of yesterday. What we need to do is make sure the Department of Transportation and the Department of the Interior and other parts of the administrative state are applying the regulations so that those greedy corporate fat cats at whatever railroad company or whatever government contracting airplane company are not able to use shoddy standards that leave American workers and consumers holding the bag. Because we don't want those doors flying off the Boeing airplanes or the trains running off the tracks. It comes from a well-intentioned place. The other view is that maybe, just maybe, it was the regulatory state itself that created the conditions of coddling that eliminated competition in the request for proposals and in the competition process to be a government contractor, that created the lethargic kind of so-called private sector that really isn't the private sector, but an extension of the public sector. It's really what Boeing has become. That was the root cause and the origin of that culture of complacency in the first place, when, again, the right answer is not to expand those regulations, but actually to rescind them to allow competition to actually work through the free market. Those are irreducible choices. Take the Department of Education. One view is that we have wrongfully been subsidizing four-year college degrees to be a four-year gender studies major in California, which, once you graduate with a load of college debt on your back, you realize that didn't get you a head start in the American dream. And so the right answer, according to the protectionist strand of the America First movement, is that we need to make sure that we're doing a better job of subsidizing two-year college degrees and vocational education. I understand the impulse, right? Are we underutilizing vocational education and two-year education program in this country? We are, actually. But one answer is to say that that's what the Department of Education needs to focus on. There's a different answer that says actually the root cause of the failure in public education in our university system was the Department of Education in the first place, and what we need to do is to shut it down and give the $80 billion back to the states and to the people of this country. So we go straight down the list. I mean, we could go all night if I went agency by agency. You get FTC. This is a big one right now. Right? Is the right answer to empower Lena Khan with a greater toolkit to determine what constitutes fair competition? Or is the right answer to say we don't want the federal government to be in the business of deciding what does or doesn't count as fair competition? The right answer is actually to constrain the scope of those regulations in the first place. This is, I think, the decisive question ahead for the conservative movement. Do we want to replace the left-wing nanny state with the right-wing nanny state, or do we want to get in there and actually dismantle the nanny state? That is the question ahead for us, and I think this is our time for choosing within our own movement itself. Underlying this, and by the way, I totally empathize with that. I'm very familiar with the soundtrack. Thank you for bringing the next generation in. My 2-year-old son, and yours is doing better than mine has on many occasions. So thank you for bringing him. But we're doing it for the next generation, and I think that's what motivates me. It's what motivates us in this room. It's not just about abstract principles or academic exercises. In a very pragmatic way, what's going to make for a better country for my 2-year-old son and probably her 6-month-old son for the next generation? That's the question ahead. Undergirding this is a deeper debate, and I'll close after this to open this up to some Q&A. I want this to be a conversation. This is not a rah-rah campaign speech here. It's intended to provoke some thought, and I hope that we're able to engage in some thoughtful exchange before I leave tonight. I think undergirding this is actually a deeper debate about identity, actually. I think that's actually the question at the heart of this divide on the American right. And it's not just the American right like neoliberals versus America First, but a divide within the future direction of America First, is really the question of what it means to be an American, actually. I think on the protectionist view, lurking underneath that is a view, a conviction even, that actually shares in common one view of the left, which is that your identity, your genetics, your lineage has something to do with how American you really are. It's what I call the blood and soil vision of American identity. You know, I had a podcast that actually went viral. I invited her on my show with Ann Coulter, who, I don't know, mad at her, actually. I thought it was pretty interesting to explore the psychology behind it, who looked me in the eye and said, I agree with most of your policy, but I couldn't vote for you because you're an Indian. And, you know, I think it reflects an interesting conception the left actually shares in common, by the way. I actually have gotten this when I visited the south side of Chicago. Somebody asked me a question, say, do you favor racial reparations in this country? I said, I don't. She actually, before she turned around and walked out of the room, turned back and said, the country was built on the back of my ancestors, not yours, and walked out of that room. And I thought it was such an interesting parallel where it's a question of identity that most nations, I want to be sympathetic to this view rather than denigrating it. Most nations have a national identity tethered to blood and soil. And what does it mean to be an Italian? What does it mean to be Japanese? That's a strong national identity dating back histories that tie to the purity of a genetic stock, that tie to the integrity of a lineage's tie to its land. That is the national identity of most nations. But not America, actually. I still do believe America is a country founded on a set of ideals that brought together a divided, even polyglot group of people 250 years ago. It's been said, even amongst other thoughtful minds on the American right, who I respect, that the reason we need that alternative identity grounded in blood and soil is that people won't fight for abstract ideals. I actually disagree with that. I think the American Revolution was fought over abstract ideals. I think that's what makes the American identity unique from that of every other nation, nearly every other nation through human history. You can make an argument for ancient Rome that viewed you could have different shades of melanin, but what they really cared about was they viewed that like the shades of difference in your eye color. What really mattered is that you were a citizen. And I think, save for ancient Rome, the United States of America is the nation in human history that defines your identity based on your citizenship and your civic allegiance to a set of ideals. And I think that debate's really what lurks beneath the surface in the future direction of America First, is even what it means to be an American. In order to put America first, you actually have to define what America actually is. And I think that we have to confront these questions in the open. The reason I reject the blood and soil vision of American identity is that it actually makes American exceptionalism impossible. The reason it makes American exceptionalism impossible is that other nations like Japan and Italy are going to have a much stronger claim on a national identity than we will. It also raises all kinds of puzzling conundrums. And what do you do with those Native Americans who were here a while ago as well, right? I mean, it's kind of an inconvenient question that we could say, okay, then it started only if you got here 250 years ago, but if you got here 50 or sooner years, then it doesn't count for you. And it becomes a very thin vision of an American identity tied to this limited time scope, blood and soil vision, versus what I think America actually is at its core, is a nation founded on a set of distinctive ideals that were enshrined in the greatest mission statement for a nation in the history of mankind, that's the Declaration of Independence, and enshrined in the most effective operating manual for those ideals, that is the U.S. Constitution. That's who we are as Americans. And I think that this is the question for the future of the American right. It relates to protectionist trade policy, it relates to protectionist immigration policy versus not the neoliberal policies of yesterday, but a national libertarian perspective that says, you know what, the right answer is we don't want to substitute the left-wing nanny state and regulatory state with our version. We want to actually get in there and shut it down, not because that's a more important objective than caring for American workers and manufacturers, but because that is our best way of actually serving American workers and manufacturers and every American citizen for the long run in a nation whose best days are still ahead of us, that's going to last not just for another 250 years. Rome made it to 2000. We might be able to make it a little further than that ourselves if we stay true to the principles that set the whole ballgame in motion the first time around. So thank you guys for coming tonight and being open to Slightly different kind of conversation. I appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm counting on you guys to take this debate to your states and do the rest. So we'll open this up for some Q&A if we do that, David, for a little bit. Thank you.
Hello, Vivek. How's it going?
Thank you. Good to see you, man. Tell me your name.
Vance again from Texas. I appreciate your comments tonight. I like the differences in the different views on both sides. Too often we don't see one side or the other. I listen to your podcast. It's a great podcast. What I'm a little concerned about still, though, is while you talk about regulations and everything else, the one thing that's kept us from that founding of America has been too much spending. That we are not a limited government anymore. And I didn't hear you say spending or national debt once.
Yeah.
And I think that's a problem. And I worked in the Trump White House. I tried to get Trump to talk more about this. But if we don't get control of spending, we're not going to get control of anything else. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I was somewhat intentional about making a pitch on the national debt or spending not the centerpiece of my pitch, though it leads to the same place. The reason is I think that people don't clerically, and the accounting nature of it, I don't think that compels people to move. After all, we would have complained about the national debt when it was 26 trillion, now it's 34. 35 and counting, right? There's a national debt clock if you want to, but who's counting, right? That's kind of part of the point. Versus getting to the root cause of what gives us that national debt, which is the nanny state as we know it. When I say nanny state, I mean there's three parts to the nanny state, all right? And I don't normally give a speech like this, but you guys are at the bleeding edge, you're at the vanguard, you're policymakers, you're thinkers, so let's just get to the stuff that my usual advisors would tell me is too boring for campaign stuff, okay? So there's three parts to the nanny state. Okay, there's the entitlement state, there's the regulatory state, and there's the foreign policy nanny state as well. My vision is shut them all down. Shut them all down, you solve your national debt problem right there. Let's go piece by piece. Entitlement state, welfare, Medicaid, any type of government assistance, attach a work requirement to it. Make work requirements pervasive to any type of government aid. That's how you shut down the entitlement state. The regulatory state, we got 4 million federal bureaucrats. Everybody, including me, is talking about the mass deportation of millions of illegals from this country, which I favor. But the real mass deportation we need is the mass deportation of millions of unelected federal bureaucrats out of Washington, D.C. You shut down the regulatory state that way. And in a post-Chevron, post-West Virginia versus EPA world, 75% or more of federal regulations are unconstitutional under existing law. Rescind those with a single order that says the Supreme Court has told us these regulations are invalid. Then you move to the foreign policy nanny state. My view is zero-based budgeting for every federal expenditure. Foreign aid should not be an exception to that question either. You've automatically solved our national debt crisis that way. And so I want to go to the root causes and one by one dismantle the areas where we're spending that money where we shouldn't. I find that, and I believe that even going forward, that's going to be a more effective problem to tackling the national debt than to talk about the esoteric national debt, where otherwise when push comes to shove, everyone's got their favorite sacred cow that they don't want to slay. And by the way, I say that as a proud practicing Hindu myself. Okay, I don't use that as I use that as an analogy to evoke an emotional response because we need an emotional response to be able to actually tackle this problem. When it comes to it, everybody's got their favorite thing they don't want to give up. Actually, if we're principled to say we want to actually shut the whole thing down, the extinguishing of the national debt is a side effect of that, but only one of many side effects. The better side effect is we've restored self-governance in the country. It's not just an economic argument. I mean, today the people we elect to run the government, they're not even the ones who actually run the government. It's unelected bureaucrats, which was actually the view of pre-revolutionary England, that the people could not be trusted to self-govern. What we're actually doing here is not just stimulating our economy. Take the regulatory state out, that's the best wet blanket. We take off our economy to actually deliver economic growth again. It's not just that we've solved our national debt crisis, it's that we've solved our civic crisis of losing our commitment to self-governance in the United States itself. So the only reason I didn't mention it is because I think it's so much bigger than that, and the national debt melts away as a consequence of pursuing the vision that I hope I've laid out tonight. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. Right there.
Thank you. First, I have to tell you that my 75-year-old mother thinks that you're going to save the Republican Party. So
What's her name? Ruth? Okay, thank you. Tell her thank you. I appreciate that.
I really appreciate what you had to say about Ida and, the work road to serfdom. And just as today we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of a brief shining moment in the history of the Republican Party, vision for what we had to do. And so I've been listening recently to the Constitution of Liberty.
Oh, that's his best.
Which is his best. It's his time to do that. And one of the things he said, I think goes to what you're saying, is that it's hard when you believe in liberty, you believe you shouldn't do something, right? It's hard to argue for that because, what does that look like? But he talks about, I think this is the central issue. We're all taught, because we're not rational, we're rationalists. We're all taught somebody's got to be in charge. Somebody has to do this. And he makes the comparisons between French liberty and English liberty in terms of, hey, somebody's got to tell everybody what to do all the time. That's French liberty. And English liberty is like, well, you really can't know that. You protect people's rights and you leave people alone. And so I think the fundamental issue that we have, and we have it in the Republican Party, is the humility to say, not only are we not smart, no one is smart enough to tell everybody else what to do, that the right thing is to have a series where all we do are protect the fundamental rights, right? And then let the market take care of it, let the people take care of it, allow this diversity to go out, and then, because that way, as Hayek says, knowledge is eventually used if you leave people free to try things.
Sure.
So what do you think about it? It's like a vision of humility is what we need to start preaching to folks instead of this idea that we can run everything. Because I don't know, maybe I describe what you say as the difference in the American First Movement is the kind of the Lighthizer wing versus the Kudlow wing. I don't know if that's a...
I don't put individual labels on it because no person I've met is 100% consistent anyway, and so then it can actually take one thing they've said and conflate it with what the actual competing vision is. Hayek called it the fatal conceit. Okay, the conceit that one person can possibly know that which no person or government can be expected to. And I do think that conservatives are falling into that trap all over again. One of the things I love, I think that this is not an issue for November 5th this year, okay? And Donald Trump, he's masterfully bridged the divide between these wings of the America First movement. That's what you got to do. To win an election in this environment, we've got to build a broad tent coalition, and that's what he's done. So this is not to take away from his accomplishment. To the contrary, I think it makes his accomplishment all the more remarkable because it's what's required to save the country from a broader assault, cultural assault on the country from an increasingly ideological left. But the question is, what is the purpose of that victory? These questions are then going to become unavoidable, either in what a second Trump term looks like, which is certainly what I'm fighting hard to make sure we have coming up. But regardless of whether it's a second Trump term or not, the future direction of what our America First movement actually is all about. And I think that there is no better time to start that conversation, to begin that conversation, and no better room in which to at least plant the early seeds of it than the one that we're in right now. So thank you. I appreciate that. Right there in the back.
Yes, sir. Philip from Georgia. Great speech. So question for you, because I've heard you talk about it before, and I'd love for you to talk about it again. This is the room. You're filled with people that we do argue with Republicans. It feels like sometimes more than we argue with Democrats.
It's healthy, though. Comes from a good place.
Well, especially if you believe in the Republican platform, because most Republicans don't for some reason. Anyway, the question I have for you, and I've heard you talk about it, and I'm pulling up some accurate numbers because I think it's relevant. So we talk about non-discretionary spending, and we're going to have a period, hopefully, God willing, and thanks for your efforts towards this, where we have the Senate, the House, and we can use the reconciliation process, and then hopefully, obviously, the White House. So we have a small window to actually get shit done, which people in this room would love to see that happen. But we talk about non-discretionary spending, which is everything is discretionary, by the way. We fund it every year, but it's really mandatory spending, right? So it's not non-discretionary. Mandatory outlays, $3.7 trillion in the current budget. $1.73 trillion of that is Medicaid, Medicare, automatic spending. Okay, not to be confused with the $1.7 trillion, which is actually less for discretionary spending. So my question to you is, when we have all of those levers of power, hopefully you're in our cabinet. I think you're awesome. You're going to be great. Are we going to do, as conservatives, are we going to use that opportunity to address non-discretionary spending and stop talking about cutting 1% of 10% of the budget and address that 33%, the fastest growing portion of the budget? That's my question.
Are we going to? I don't know, actually. Should we? Absolutely. right? That's, I think, the question is less about making predictions about where we will go. We're not a bunch of people here, betting on the future. We're hopefully a bunch of people in this room shaping the future. And so the question for us is, do we have the spine to make that short-term trade-off? You can make a sacrifice when you know what you're actually sacrificing for. And for me, that's the future identity of the United States of America itself. A very pragmatic way to do it, and I think it's come up in a couple of the questions. I think approaching this through the numbers and working backwards has just empirically proven to be an unsuccessful approach. Because when push comes to shove, everybody can talk about the level of spending being unsustainable. When everyone comes to whatever they're willing to give up, it ends up being nothing, and you need collective action to do it. Versus a principles-based approach that actually achieves a civic or national objective that has the byproduct of actually just reducing the spending itself. So the civic principle here is, I think we've culturally lost our commitment to hard work as just a cultural attribute in the United States of America. I think we used to be a country, what does it mean to be an American culturally? It means we believe in the meritocracy. The best person gets the job, not based on your skin color or your genetics. It means we believe in free speech, open debate, that you get to speak your mind openly as long as I get to in return. It means we believe in self-governance. As I said earlier, the people we elect to run the government, for God's sake, should be the ones who actually run the government, not unelected bureaucrats in the three-letter agencies that populate this town. One of the things it means to be an American is we work hard, that you believe that you can achieve the maximum of your God-given potential. I didn't say that you can achieve anything you ever want, but you can achieve the maximum of your own God-given potential with your own hard work and commitment and dedication. That's a national attribute we've lost. Why have we lost it? We've lost it because the government actually created and coddled the American populace to create the conditions where we had no reason to feel that we needed to work hard. But it's no surprise that we've seen actually in the name of helping the very people that the LBJ-driven Great Society was on steroids even over the course of COVID. Let's be honest, Republicans and Democrats both extended the Great Society in new clothing. What we've actually created is a culture that not only lost hard work and added to the national debt, added to the trajectory of so-called non-discretionary spending, but also one where we see an uptick in depression, anxiety, fentanyl usage, mental health illness. You think that's an accident? There's symptoms of that deeper void. So I take a principles-based approach to say any form of government aid, any form of the welfare state, that includes not just Medicaid, it includes straight-up welfare as well. We're attaching the kinds of work requirements that do this not because we're solving some sort of clerical accounting problem, but because we actually respect the dignity of the individual who is on the other side of it, that we believe in them enough to say that, you know what, you deserve to have us regard you with enough respect to say that, yes, this is going to be a temporary measure in your life or a period in your life where we've had a social contract signed 60 years ago that recognizes we're not going to leave you behind. But part of how we're not going to leave you behind is by reviving what made America great the first time around, which is the idea of industrious self-creation and self-sufficiency in production. And that's something that the conservative movement's been shy to stand for right now. I don't want to see, as I said, I don't want to replace the left-wing nanny state with the right-wing nanny state, the left-wing regulatory state with the right-wing regulatory state. I don't want to replace left-wing victimhood culture with right-wing victimhood culture, actually. And I think that we owe it to ourselves and to our movement and to the future of this country to man up and have those conversations, because I think those are going to have real trade-offs in the future direction of what you think about more of a patronage state. You can call it industrial policy. That sounds pretty good. But you can put whatever label you want on it, but it's using government assistance to coddle certain new favored forms of groups rather than actually saying that what we really need is to create a culture of self-sufficiency in the United States, both at the corporate level and at the individual level. And as a byproduct of that, what you call non-discretionary spending or mandatory spending, I'm not being an accountant about this because I don't think that approach works. I have a business background. We could do it that way. Just recent history teaches us that doesn't work. But a principles-based approach that involves reviving our national identity, who are we? Stay true to that. Turns out our national debt and our non-discretionary spending along with it melts right away. And I think that's going to be the approach that allows us to succeed in the next 10 years in a way that we haven't in the last 10 years. Right over here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. I don't get, Michael Hamilton from Ohio, I don't often get to ask a question about ancient Rome, but since you went there first, About 100 years before.
And I grew up not far from Hamilton, so
yeah, about 100
Ohio into another. Yeah.
About 100 years before Rome collapsed into an imperial monarchy, they changed their fiscal policy, and Rome underwent a radical shift from essentially having the provinces, the people in the provinces that they had conquered, essentially go about life in the way that they were used to, and also, importantly, they had a cap on the amount of money that they, the central government in Rome, could go ahead and spend on different projects. And then 100 years before, we see Julius Caesar and then Octavian, Augustus come in. They changed that policy for reasons we won't get into tonight. And they start taxing all of their client states. And the lid of the honeypot comes off. There's unlimited money. In our last 100 years in the United States, we've seen, of course, the creation of the Federal Reserve. We've seen the Great Society programs. We've seen the well-intentioned public works programs before the Great Society and, during World War II and the Great Depression. We've seen the 2008 bailout and beyond. And now we have a balance sheet that we can hardly have enough paper to hold it with the national debt and the Federal Reserve. My question is, to what extent do you see America's monetary policy and fiscal policy profligacy as a threat to the existence of our republic if we do not check it and check it quickly?
I see it as a serious, pragmatic, clear and present threat to the future existence of the United States of America. That's my position on it. But, and I'll come back to this in a moment, I also believe it is a symptom of an even deeper void, which I'll close on. Let me address the Roman point for a second. Rome had a way of dealing with this. They would just go to like North Africa and plunder, and when the amount of silver in the denarius got diluted by 1/100th, they just go to some other country and get more silver. Right? That was one way they would solve the problem. We neither should desire to do it that way, nor have we been particularly good at it. When we go to other places around the world, we spend $7 trillion, and then Iraq's a more broken country than when we showed up, and the Taliban's still in charge 20 years later in Afghanistan, $80 billion the richer for our military equipment that we live there. So for two very practical reasons, one is it is normatively undesirable, and two is we have proven ourselves incompetent to be able to do it effectively that way anyway. I don't think that that is a Roman model that we're going to be able to replicate, which means the way we're actually going to have to replicate it is actually to be disciplined in the way that we actually collect and spend our money. And I say a word about the Federal Reserve. This is exactly another example of, in the bailouts of 2008. I mean, once you see the distinction that I've drawn between the National Protectionist Division and the National Libertarian Division, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. Even in this question about the Federal Reserve, you hear a lot of America First Republicans rail about, and I agree with them, about the fact that executives at banks should not earn their excess bonuses or deferred compensation after receiving a taxpayer bailout to help fund it. But here's a better solution. How about the federal government not be in the business of bailing out those banks in the first place, and a Federal Reserve that goes back to, if you're going to have it, at least one purpose of stabilizing the U.S. dollar as a unit of measurement, period. It's that managerial class at the other three-letter agency, the FED, that effectively said, okay, we're going to try to hit inflation and unemployment at the same time. It's like being a drunkard in a bar trying to throw a dart, hit two arrows with one dart, hit two targets at the same time. You're badly missing on both. That's exactly the way the Federal Reserve's been operated after the managerial class took it over in the late 1990s. So once you see this distinction, you see it everywhere. But I view even that as a symptom of a deeper void. What I see in the country is, I was with the ambassador of another major country earlier today before I came here, and he said the question for us is, does America still believe in itself, actually? That's just what the rest of the world is waiting for. Just give us the answer, right? We can't tell you guys the answer to that. But when you guys have figured it out, let us know, because we need to get on with it one way or another. And if America doesn't believe in itself, fine, then somebody else is going to fill the void. That was a reference to China. But just tell us when you guys have figured it out. And I think that these are our economic malaise, our national debt crisis, the stagnating economic growth, even our border crisis. These are symptoms of a deeper void. We are in the middle of a national identity crisis. We have lost our sense of who we are as a country, and we fall into the trap. I have fallen into this trap. Even over the last 2 years, I have fallen into this trap of focusing on the symptom. On the economic side, we've talked about a lot of the symptoms today. On the cultural side, you could talk about wokeism or transgenderism or climatism or COVIDism, without asking ourselves why we see the rise of these poisons one at a time. They're symptoms of a deeper void of purpose and meaning and identity in our country. We, especially my generation, I speak to you as somebody who was the youngest person ever to run for U.S. president as a Republican. I could tell you, especially my generation, but I think it's true of all of us, we are hungry to be part of something bigger than ourselves, yet we can't even answer what it means to be an American in the year 2024. And if you ask me, what does it mean to be an American today? It means we still believe in the ideals of 1776. It means we still believe in merit and free speech and the rule of law and self-governance in this country. It means we still believe in the American dream, the idea that no matter who you are or where your parents came from or what your skin color is, that you still get ahead in the United States of America with your own hard work, your own commitment, your own dedication, and that you are free to speak your mind at every step of the way. That is the American dream. That is what we as a movement are running to. We're not just running from something. And if I may close on this with you all tonight, as a conservative movement, I think we are done and we have to be done just running from something. I'm in this to make sure we're running back to something, back to our vision of what it means to be a citizen of the United States of America, not some nebulous global citizen fighting climate change somewhere, but a citizen of the greatest nation known to mankind, and to be proud of it. And if we do, our best days as a nation are still yet ahead of us. God bless you and your families, and may God bless our United States of America. Do not stop fighting for liberty. It is a nation worth saving, and save it we will. Thank you, guys. God bless you. Thank you. Thank you.